Welcome back. Here in Section 7, we're going to go over purchase orders and an important concept known as the process of offer, acceptance, and consideration. It's important to note that there is some legal terminology that we'll be using here, but it is also even more important to note that we here at Mercado are not lawyers. This is not legal advice that we're offering. We're just sharing information. Let's get going. Regardless of whether a U.S. importer uses a purchase agreement or a purchase order as the contractual document, all purchasing transactions are completed through the process known as offer, acceptance, and consideration. That's a summary of what was spoken of before. As we move forward, our focus will indeed be on purchase orders themselves. Second bullet, to kick off this explanation of the process, essentially, offer is the supplier's offer to sell, the vendor overseas offering to sell to the U.S. importer. From there, the U.S. importer's purchase order is acceptance, exactly what the term would imply, acceptance of the offer to sell. Perhaps after some negotiation, but acceptance in and of itself. And consideration, which we won't talk too much about at all, represents the method and terms of payment between the supplier and the U.S. importer. We're focusing on the offer to sell and the purchase order as tangible proof of the acceptance of that offer to sell. Really the foundation of the documentation trail. As we said, albeit briefly, the term offer refers to the overseas vendor's offer to sell a product and or service. It depends on the situation, but it could be a response to a U.S. importer's request for proposal, but can also be in the form of a sales quotation to a potential customer, again, a U.S. importer. In either case, second bullet, the offer to sell must capture the terms under which a seller, that supplier overseas, is willing to make a sale. All of the terms that we've talked about and will continue to study as we move forward. As is the case with many of our studies, oftentimes it's just better to put forward a real-world example to illustrate the points that we're talking about. So here, we're going to study a supplier's quotation to a U.S. importer. The sourcing team from an importer of stainless steel culinary equipment has gone through the process of vetting a potential vendor in Sicily and is now seeking quotations from that vendor. That sourcing team went through all of the things we talked about in our sourcing module. Because the U.S. importer, which is located in Rochester, New York, needs a new supplier for pasta cutting machines, they are interested in making a single unit purchase. They're going to test them out, essentially. The following slide shows the first quotation from this vendor, which of course serves as the supplier's offer to sell. That's the illustration we're making here. Upon receipt, it is the importer's job to analyze the quotation, make sure that it contains all the information necessary to negotiate further, and ultimately make an informed purchasing decision. A quick emphasis on negotiation. The offer to sell comes in from the overseas vendor. It's not likely that a U.S. importer is going to accept every term of that offer to sell, so some negotiation has to take place. We'll see the difference in what was offered and what was agreed upon in subsequent documents. In the meantime, let's wrap this up and then study the actual offer to sell. Should the Rochester importer decide to make a purchase, subsequent documents that will need to be generated at a very minimum are a purchase order and commercial invoice. That idea of the creation of a documentation trail that represents each step in the life of an international transaction. Okay, let's analyze what we have here. Let's start at the beginning with the title of this document, a price quotation, which is in a pro forma format. We've talked a little bit about this before, but a pro forma invoice is indeed an invoice, but it's not a bill. Lots of sellers overseas like to use a pro forma invoice format because it's very similar to the commercial invoice should an actual sale take place. There's familiarity with the format, but this is not a bill. A pro forma invoice serves a number of purposes in international trade. In this case, it's an invoice that isn't a bill. It's a quotation at the end of the day. So who do we have here? Full name of the seller and potential buyer. Our vendor overseas is a company called Equipos Culinarios with some addresses in Corleone, Sicily, Italy. Anyone that's a fan of the movie series The Godfather from the 1970s and 80s will recognize some names there. Just a feeble attempt at humor. Potentially sold to a company called Culinary Supply Corporation in Rochester, New York. to the attention of Elizabeth Crocker. Maybe she goes by the name Betty, but who knows. On the right-hand side, spelled out date. We've talked in the past about the importance of spelling out dates, so we continue with that practice. The vendor is providing a sales quote number so that should a sale take place 30 days down the road, 60 days down the road, they can reference that original quote and know exactly what they're talking about. Payment terms, 30 days from invoice date. Delivery terms, which represent our Incoterms, we'll come back to this in just a moment. CIP, carriage and insurance paid to, in this instance, the U.S. destination port. What that means is that whatever the price offered by the seller includes transportation, in this case air freight, with minimum cover insurance up to a named place at destination, U.S. destination airport. Given the U.S. buyer is in Rochester, New York, it's more than likely JFK. More on Incoterms in just a second. We mentioned the mode of transport as air freight. The quote is valid through April 1st, so that's a 60-day period from February 1st through April 1st. But the last ship date, which is always important to have in a quotation, is 60 days from the PO date, the purchase order date. So if this company in Rochester places a purchase order, the company in Sicily, Equipos Culinarios, has 60 days from the date of PO to ship. Let's get into quantities and description and such. What do we have here? A quantity of 1. We already said this is a test shipment from the vendor in Sicily. It's a stainless steel pasta cutter, model number A5SPC. It weighs 30 kilos, about 65, 66 pounds. The DIMs are in centimeters. Moving across, the unit price, 21,000. But 21,000 what? The symbol there is for the euro, but we want to be explicit. So you'll notice in the lower left-hand side, currency of sale, euro. Very important to be emphatic about that currency of sale for an extended price of 21,000. But we said that the price is under a CIP U.S. destination airport Incoterm. That means that the seller is responsible for transportation and minimum cover insurance up until that U.S. destination airport, probably JFK, as we also said. That's why we see in the body of this quotation, inland freight at origin from the factory in Sicily to the export airport, inland freight at origin and air freight charges, €1,000. Minimum cover insurance, €200. We already talked about the currency in euro. Country of origin, Italy. So we get down to the bottom here. CIP, U.S. airport of destination, €22,200. That's the offer to sell. As we move forward, we'll see the result of that negotiation between the seller in Sicily and the buyer in the U.S. This slide summarizes much of what we've spoken of. Upon receiving an RFP response or quotation from a vendor, as we saw just a moment ago, the U.S. importer decides the terms under which he or she is willing to make a purchase. The negotiation of the terms. And as we follow this example in future sections, we'll see what the differences were between the offer to sell and the actual PO. Acceptance takes place when the U.S. importer expresses official acceptance of the purchase terms. Essentially, the document that provides proof of acceptance is the purchase order itself. It's all very much a process, a sequential process. Final slide in this section. Consideration is the payment given in exchange for the buyer's receipt of goods and or services. It's the terms of payment, basically. Cash up front, credit terms, stage payments, etc. The form of payment is usually in legal tender, a currency-based payment, certainly the case in our example. But there are other terms, barter being the best example. And as a trade tip, we've talked about this before. Many vendors in Asia require staged payments. For example, 30% up front, balance due upon receipt of the forwarder's cargo receipt. Those terms can be negotiated, but it's important to point out that a lot of vendors in Asia operate on this premise. Maybe it's 40% up front, maybe it's 50%, who knows? But it's not unusual to see staged payments. So that's the end of section 7. We will continue this story upon our return.